welcome. You are here for Unit 2.3, Habitats and Biodiversity, the unit overview. My name is Janita Vasquez, and I am the Elementary Curriculum Manager for OpenSciEd. And joining me today is Samantha Richard. Samantha was our lead writer in the revision for this unit, so we're excited to have her here today. So let me tell you a little bit about what we're going to do today. We're going to learn just a little bit about OpenSciEd and elementary in case you're not familiar with our materials. Then Sam is going to walk us through the first lesson of this unit. And she's also going to give us a tour of the unit storyline. So you get to see and hear about every single lesson in this unit. Then Sam is going to share with us some key features of this unit, great things that she wants to share with us. And then we're going to talk a little bit about some additional resources for you on our website. So first of all, OpenSciEd is an innovative nonprofit organization. We bring together fantastic curriculum developers, state science administrators, teachers, and philanthropic organizations to develop free, high-quality science materials and the professional learning that goes along with those materials. We field tested our units in 9 partner states with over 450 teachers. And really what that means is we had all those teachers and their almost 10,000 students providing us feedback that we needed to help us make these the best units possible. So a little bit about our materials. So first, we use a storyline model to develop all of our units. And that means that we start off with an interesting anchoring phenomenon, a question that students will want to answer. And we follow that question and do research and observations and do reading and do lots of work together to figure out what is happening in whatever that phenomenon is. So the units are meant to be engaging to students. We want them to ask lots of questions about the phenomenon they're encountering, and then we use those questions to drive unit learning. The lessons are connected in service of making sense of all the science, and we use lots of investigations and research to get us there. We design our units for flexible use in classrooms. That means that while we have a recommended sequence, we do build these to be flexible and modular so that you can think about how they best fit into your school year. Also, a little bit more specifics about the units. In K5, we offer 4 units per grade, always 4 units. In K2, that means that we have 10 lessons per unit, and each of those lessons is 60 minutes long. Now, please understand that in OpenSciEd, a lesson is not one point in time. We think of those 60 minutes as being flexible so that you can schedule them within your school day, your school week, or even across weeks if that's something you need to do. In K2, that adds up to about 2,400 minutes per school year, which compared to a typical school year is about 4.5% of your instructional time. In grades 3-5, we have up to 15 units per unit. Up to 15 lessons per unit, usually between 12 and 15. And each of those is 90 minutes. And again, those 90 minutes are meant to be flexible so that you can schedule them how they best fit into your school year. And those add up to about 5,400 minutes of instruction, which is only about 10% of your instructional time. So we have built these units so they are manageable and fit into a full school year. Right. In our materials, we think it's really important to integrate mathematics and literacy. Anytime in our units that you see math, we do that for the purpose of helping us make sense of any science that is happening in the unit. We integrate math through math talks, modeling, and data concepts. We spent most of our time really thinking about data. Students as early as in kindergarten are planning investigations, gathering data, analyzing data. So that's a huge connection for us. Also, in literacy, we have these wonderful collection of student books that have been created especially for our program by our writers. They are all meant to be informational text. We leverage that text as a tool to gather information, to learn vocabulary, and engage students in lots of ways of communicating. When we say communicating, we mean orally, in writing, using gestures, drawing pictures. We want students to be able to show us their learning in lots of different ways. We also offer a comprehensive assessment system. So you can see all the different types of assessments that are included in our program, but along with those, we also offer you guidance about what to do with that data once you have it. How do I help my students that didn't understand? Where do I go next? We also provide rubrics and all sorts of different supports for you as an educator. And if you're interested in our classroom materials, we have lots of vendor partners that are available to either purchase kits from or printed materials. But as always, you can find all of our teacher and student materials on our website at no cost. And we also provide you with a materials list should you or your district decide that you rather purchase materials individually. So it's time for me to stop talking about OpenSciEd and for Sam to talk to us about this unit.
Hi, I'll be talking about Unit 2.3, the Habitats and Biodiversity Unit, what lives where. As mentioned earlier, there are 10 lessons in this second grade unit, 60 minutes per lesson. And as we walk through the 2.3 unit, we will highlight how each part of the OpenSciEd instructional model is used to support student sense making. This model follows a pathway that begins with an anchoring phenomenon, followed by investigation lessons where students gather evidence to figure things out. About midway through, there's a putting the pieces together opportunity to help students synthesize what have figured out so far. And then students engage in additional investigations to deepen their understanding before ending the unit with a final putting pieces together lesson where they make sense of everything they've figured out. So I will begin introducing you to the unit by spending a little more time talking through the anchoring phenomenon lesson. In all OpenSciEd units, the first lesson serves several important purposes. It introduces an interesting phenomenon or problem to spark curiosity. It gives students an opportunity to share their initial ideas. It motivates students to ask questions they will investigate throughout the unit. And it also serves as a pre-assessment opportunity for the teacher to learn what students already know or wonder about. So, in this unit, the phenomenon is a puzzling pattern of being able to encounter plants and animals in different kinds of places. So as we walk through this opening lesson, you'll see how this idea of different places is layered in different ways across the lesson. So it begins with a shared local experience of teachers sharing an animal or plant encounter that the class maybe has had together. Maybe there was a spider or an insect in the window of the classroom, or maybe outside on the schoolyard, we noticed a new plant growing. So sharing that experience to really launch things off to get us thinking about, hey, there are plants and animals around us. Usually when we go outside, we might notice one. And then it broadens out to give students a chance to share some of their own connected experiences, really building in that discussion piece. When have you seen a plant or animal outside? What plant or animal did you see? Where were you? What was that place like? So students can share some of their experiences, maybe at school, maybe outside of school, within their communities, to start thinking about, hey, oftentimes, again, when we go outside, we can encounter a plant or animal. Leading us then thinking about, well, how can we find out more about these places with plants and animals to start investigating this phenomena a little bit more in a shared way? So next, students might share some ideas like maybe we can go outside together, maybe we can share more of our experiences. And in this lesson, we decide to go outside, either in our schoolyard or a chosen outdoor space. That might make sense for the local context. So students are really, their ideas are really integral in planning out what this outdoor investigation to make some observations will look like. So actually like thinking about when we do go outside, what are some places we can look on our schoolyard? And students also have a hand in planning how they would record those observations, thinking about how we could use our spoken words, our drawings, our written words to be able to record and then later share our observations. Another important piece of this first lesson is taking some time to revisit our classroom agreements. To think about before we go outside and start engaging in science together, what does it look like? What does it sound like when we're going to do that, when we're going to be making observations and sharing our ideas? And really also specific to this unit is how are we going to interact with nature and our environment in respectful ways while we're doing science? So then students get to go outside and see about where they might have a plant or animal encounter and record those observations. And then they come back inside and have their first opportunity to share their ideas using a notice and wonder chart. So this is an opportunity for students to discuss what their observations were and record it in a public place in the classroom, and also start sharing some of their questions about the plants and animals that they saw and the places where they saw those plants and animals. And so again, remembering that this anchor lesson is really building on this puzzling pattern of being able to encounter plants and animals in different places. So far, we've had some shared school experiences. We've talked a little bit about in our communities, but what about places outside of our communities? So the teacher at this point introduces some of the national parks, which represent places in different regions of the United States. So students can virtually visit these places to have some of these plant and animal encounters. So we have Cape Cod National Seashore in Massachusetts, Congaree National Park in South Carolina, Katmai National Park and Preserve in Alaska, Olympic National Park in Washington, Saguaro National Park in Arizona, and Tallgrass National Preserve in Kansas. Also taking some time to see on a map where these different places are and also where our classroom is too in comparison. And then students have an opportunity to work in groups. And this shows an example of students would access these digitally and they're able to see a zoomed out picture really showing the landscape of that place to really get a feel for what it looks like, what might be there. A zoomed in picture of an animal, and then also sound clips as well of what it sounds like in that area. So there's one of these slides for each of the different national parks for students to look at. And so we'll jump through those. And then again, having those opportunities to record these growing observations of this repeated experience that we're having across different places. So when students work in groups to make those observations, they get to come back into the scientist circle and continue their noticing and wondering on that notice and wonder chart. And from here, we've now seen many different kinds of places and have shared many observations of different kinds of plants, different kinds of animals, different kinds of places. leading to some questions that we might have about these places, about what those areas look like, maybe about the land, maybe about the water. Noticing like some of them seem to have a lot of water, maybe some of them didn't. Some of them had a lot of plant cover, some of them didn't. Maybe we noticed different kinds of plants in different areas. Are the same plants and animals in these same areas? Do they live in similar parts of these places? Do the kinds of plants and animals that live near us also live in other places? So there's really a lot of questions that students bring from these experiences, leading to an overarching question that could be something like, what lives where? What kinds of plants and animals live where? Which gives us some opportunities to really dig in and investigate what kinds of plants and animals live in different places, and also where are these places? How are they similar? How are they different? And at this point in the lesson, students actually get to brainstorm some ideas for investigation. Investigations is one of the science and engineering practices that's developed over the course of this unit. So students get to think about how could we answer some of these questions through maybe firsthand investigations or research. So this is the part in the lesson where they actually get to think about some of those ideas of how they could start answering their questions. And so these ideas for investigation get recorded. And students get to make some decisions at the end of this first lesson of which questions are we going to answer first. And in this storyline, as I just mentioned, we kind of have these two big groups of questions. We have questions about kinds of plants and animals in different places, but also some questions about the places themselves. So there's some navigation moves here in this lesson where we have to make some decisions of like which one of those big groups of questions are we going to answer first. And in this storyline, we transition to answering some of those questions about the places first, where plants and animals live, how they're similar and different. And one of the ways that we start thinking about this is making some connections to our local communities. So students actually get a chance to take home a community connection where they get to bring back ideas to the classroom about places within their community where plants and or animals live. And that brings us into the second lesson. So as a recap, that was our anchoring phenomena lesson and bringing us back to our instructional model. And before moving into the rest of the unit, I want to take a moment to highlight how navigation works across the lessons. An integral part of the storyline instructional model is navigation, deciding together between steps what we need to do next so the unit is coherent from a student's perspective. This class has a shared mission to figure things out, and the sequence of work in the unit helps them make progress on answering their many questions. If someone were to ask a student, what are you doing, or why are you doing that today? They should be able to connect it back to their own questions about the phenomenon. So for example, we might say, we're trying to figure out how places, plants, and animals live are similar and different, rather than just saying, my teacher said this is what we're doing today. So let's tour the rest of this unit by lesson type and see how the lessons are connected. Most of the lessons in a storyline unit are investigation lessons. So students engage in science and engineering practices. Students collaborate to create a plan of action. Teachers provide students with space to grapple with and figure out and make sense of science ideas. And so here we're gonna start talking about some of the investigation lessons in this unit. So as we mentioned, coming out of lesson 1, we had those big groups of questions, and we just decided to start investigating the ones about where plants and animals live and what those places are like. So using that community connection, we can start connecting to some ideas that some of the places plants and animals live from our own experiences, we've already noticed these are places on land or maybe on water. So again, we're kind of at that juncture of we need to start somewhere. So lesson 2 is, what is the land like in places where plants and animals live? So in this lesson, we share about the land and water where we can find plants and animals in our communities. And collectively, we start making those decisions on how we're really going to start diving in and answering those questions. So in this lesson, we decide to use research and we decide to gather some more information about land. And this is the first lesson in which students use the Explore Extraordinary National Parks website and begin a unit-long research project where they're using research to help answer their questions across the course of the unit. So this lesson is a really important lesson in that students break into their research teams. Each research team gets to research a different national park over the course of the unit. And students are introduced to how to access a website and navigate the website, looking for specific information that might be helpful for answering their questions. They gain experiences in recording information, so they're able to communicate it with their classmates. And in this lesson, the focus is on the land, and students are able to come together and share their research to start noticing some different patterns about land in these different places where plants and animals live. Figuring some things out, like there are different shapes and kinds of land, both in our communities and the national parks. Noticing other patterns, like land can be different shapes, like some land is flat, like plains, or other land is not flat, like mountains or hills. And land can also be different kinds, like deserts or prairies and forests and beaches. So collectively, students are able to start bringing some of that research together. We were wondering, what is the water like? So that brings us to lesson 3. Where is water found and what is it like? So students continue to get to build their experiences, obtaining information from the website, to record information about the water in the different national parks, really focusing again on like the shapes of the water and the kinds of the water. So they're then able to bring that information back together for some shared sense making about how there's different kinds of bodies of water. Some of these places have lakes, or rivers or oceans, and we're able to really use our research to notice what those look like and how those bodies of waters look like in relationship to the land around them as places where plants and animals can live. We also, through our research, start noticing that there are some other differences in water too. We noticed that there was ice in some places. So in lesson 3, students also get to further investigate ice and water, making some observations of solid water in the form of ice and also liquid water. And use a new type of text for this unit, an infographic, to build more ideas that water can be solid or liquid dependent on temperature. So if they were to go to a new place and see ice or see water, they could recognize that both solid and liquid water exist in places where plants and animals live. So from here, we've done a lot of figuring out about the land and water in these places, but again, we've been researching our own national parks and bringing together some of our research, but we're wondering how we can really show our research to one another about the land and bodies of water, like specific within the national parks that we're researching. And that's how we move into lesson 4. So lesson 4 is how can we show the location, shapes, and kinds of land and water in a place. So in this lesson, students get to investigate maps and how maps are a really important tool that scientists can use to represent land and water in a place. Students are also introduced to mapping through a Meet the Expert book. Flor San Germano, who is a scientist who studies plant and animal populations, and map making is really integral in her work. So through this book, we get to see a lot of examples of maps and how land can be represented on maps and water using colors and different symbols, and how scientists can use these to do a lot of figuring out about where plants and animals live, really connected to the work students are doing in this unit. And students also in this lesson get to investigate different interactive maps, one made of construction paper, one made of clay, and one dry erase map, where they get some firsthand experiences interacting with and using different colors and representations to construct and deconstruct maps to show land and water in a place. So now that we've done some figuring out about how we can communicate using maps, what we figured out about land and water, we are ready to bring all of these ideas together to create our own maps of the land and water in national parks so we can do some comparisons across them as a class. So before moving on to lesson 5, I want to point out that there are important moments in the unit where students put the pieces together. These putting the pieces together lessons give students the chance to connect ideas they have figured out across multiple lessons and apply these ideas to unit phenomenon. It's also a time for students to take stock of their learning and work together to develop a fuller explanation of what they're figuring out, so the unit feels coherent and meaningful from their point of view. Okay, so then coming in to lesson 5, we're ready to come together for that putting the pieces together moment to answer that first bigger question that we had about how are places where plants and animals live similar and different. So in this lesson, we're ready to bring together what we figured out about the land in the national park we researched, the water in the national park we researched, and we had these experiences with mapping, especially using certain materials. So thinking back to lesson 4, where students got to interact with different maps with those materials like the construction paper and the dry erase and the clay. All those experiences are really meaningful scaffolds coming into lesson 5 where students are ready to make their own maps. And something that's provided with this lesson, and also even lesson 4 too, when students are doing those more materials heavy type investigations or making those products, is we do have teacher references that have great tips for managing the materials, distributing the materials, what each either student or group needs for those more materials heavy activities within the lesson. So this lesson is no exception. So there is one of those TREFs like coming into this moment where we're bringing together our research and we're bringing together like using different materials. So between the experiences students have in lesson 4, actually getting to use some clay maps, and then some additional supports on the teacher side, students are now ready to make their own maps using clay in lesson 5. And so there are also some scaffolds built into the lesson as well. The class collectively develops a gotta have it checklist to help think about what are we going to include in each of these maps? And if we're going to be using these maps for some shared sense making and communicating information, making sure that there are common features and uses of color that all students can recognize. So we're able to really make some comparisons between our maps. So for example, like as a class, we might, as part of this, we put together a key where students decide what color clay represents what feature. So for example, brown, or in this example on the slide, red represents land, blue represents water, white represents solid water, or we might also have green to represent land with a lot of plant cover. So that's all built into the lesson. So students can be really successful synthesizing what they've figured out across the unit and representing that in their maps. Once students have made their maps, they also have opportunities to write about the land and water and anything they want to share from their research. And here's an example of that handout. You'll notice there's a spot at the top where students could put a photograph of their maps, or if we're using the maps the same day and can be stored in the classroom, this handout can just be right alongside their maps when students do a gallery tour later in the lesson. So there's a lot of options depending on space and availability. So if you're in a, so when students are ready to share, if you're able to store the maps, or if you're able to do it on the same day, we can just use those maps in the handout. Or if storage might be challenging, or other circumstances, there's always that option too, where students can take pictures of their maps and put it right on the handout to use within this lesson when they start doing those comparisons across the different national parks. So once students develop their maps, they do share them, as I just mentioned. And from there, they do that as a gallery tour. And they use an additional handout where they can record what is similar between their map and maps of other national parks and what's different. And this handout is actually an addition to the public release unit that field test teachers recommended, that we were able to take up that suggestion and work closely with our field test teachers to provide that tool to facilitate the shared sense making that happens in this lesson when students work towards answering the question, how are places where plants and animals similar and different? So students come back together in the scientist circle and they're able to share their observations from looking at the different maps. To end this lesson set, having figured out that each of our maps show that different places have land and water, and our maps also help show where that land and water is located, and also the shapes and kinds of the land and water and where they're located can really vary place to place. Sometimes there's similarities, like for example, more than one place might have an ocean or a lake where others might have differences. One might have a river, one might have a lake. Similar with land, there might be differences, but overall, collectively, by looking across these different places, we can figure out that there's really a variety of land and water where plants and animals could live. So coming out of this lesson, we have another opportunity to take stock of what we figured out and recall the questions that we still have. There's still things that we need to investigate, especially about kinds of plants and animals. So before jumping into lesson 6, I just wanted to briefly return to the instructional model as a reminder that we're returning back to investigation lessons with lesson 6. So in lesson 6, we start investigating those big questions about what kinds of plants and animals live in different places. And similar to the structure of the anchor lesson, we return back to our local schoolyard and community to begin these investigations with a place that's familiar to us. In this lesson, students take some time to work on planning an investigation where they go back out onto the schoolyard. And you can see in this handout here, this is the part of the unit where we're really shifting into the practice of planning and carrying out investigations. So we really think about when we make observations, how are we using our different senses? And what are some ways that we can make observations that we can share and compare with our classmates as well? So something to know about this lesson is students in 2nd grade, they're not expected to know the everyday or the scientific names of the plants and animals that they're observing. While some students might know them, there might be some plants and animals that are unfamiliar. So this lesson works through some ways to describe plants and animals that can work no matter where students are in their background knowledge of the names of plants and animals. So the teacher guide suggests for plants using short ground plants, medium-sized plants, and high-reaching plants. And there's some great math integration and some teaching tips in the teacher guide about how we can use those terms and kind of even act it out. So like a short ground plant might be one that we have to crouch down to the ground to observe. A high reaching plant might be one that we'd have to reach really tall or to reach the top, or we might not even be able to. And a mid-sized plant is somewhere in between. And it's just a way for students to be able to have some common language around the plants that they're describing. And then similarly, number of legs is suggested for animals, depending on students. If students have come from other OpenSciEd units, there might be some traits that they're familiar with of animals from first grade units. However, if they haven't, then the number of legs is something that students can count. Either there's 0 legs, 2 legs, 4 legs, or many legs. So again, having some common ways to compare the plants and animals without needing too much background knowledge on the plants and animals themselves. So you'll notice that on the handouts for this lesson. So students go outside. This lesson does have magnifying glasses as one of the materials. So students can really look at animals and plants, both big and small. And students come back together to figure out that there are a variety of plants that live on our schoolyard and a variety of animals. And there might be different ways that we come to that idea of variety or biodiversity on our schoolyard. There might be a lot of short ground plants, but maybe they're different colors. Or maybe we found one short ground plant, one medium-sized plant, and one high-reaching plant. So depending on where you are, that could look really different. But really the overall goal of lesson 6, and then in lesson 7 and 8 too, is to see some sort of variety. And so now that we've looked locally, we're wondering what kinds of plants and animals live in the national parks. So in this lesson, similar to lesson 6, we're wondering about the kinds of plants and animals that live now in the national parks. And this lesson is different from lesson 6 because we're not at the national parks. Lesson 6 was all about making firsthand observations, where lesson 7, we have to do it a different way. This lesson has a newspaper article, which is a new type of text that we haven't used yet in the unit. And it's an article about a new plant discovered at Big Bend National Park. And the way that the new plant was discovered was through a photograph that was uploaded through a citizen science project. So this is a springboard for talking about media-based observations and how scientists can use photographs and images to make observations. So in this lesson, students get to do a card sort where for each national park, there's a set of 10 animal cards and 10 plant cards. And they sort those cards using the same groups that they used on the schoolyard. And something that you'll notice on the plant cards is the plants are in pictures where there's some scale. So students are able to see their relative size. And again, something to remember is the overall goal is to notice some variety. So as long as students are using evidence from the photographs to justify why they chose a different group to put their cards in, that's what we want them to do. So there might be some disagreement. Some kids might say, one plant is short, one plant is medium, but as long as they have evidence from their picture to support their ideas, that's really the goal. So that's something to be aware of going into this investigation, especially with the plant cards. So then we figure out in this lesson that for a given national park, some of the plants are similar to one another. For example, like there might be multiple short plants, or plants might be different. Same thing with animals. There are similarities and differences between the animals in these national parks. So we're starting to see this emerging pattern of biodiversity through noticing similarities and differences of plants and animals, first locally, then in the national parks. So we're really starting to build those ideas. And so now that we've investigated the kinds of plants and animals that live in each national park, we want to connect back to that first lesson set. And we still have some questions about what kinds live on land and what kinds live in water. So that brings us to lesson 8. So in this investigation lesson, students bring together a lot of the resources that they've used already to help answer this question. So in lesson 8, students return to the Exploring Extraordinary National Parks website, where they gather information about where the plants and animals on their sorting cards live, either on land or in or near water. And so they do an additional sort with those cards to say which plants live on land, which live in or near water, and same for animals. There's a lot of different ways to facilitate this activity that are mentioned in the teacher guide, depending on time and availability. You might have partners do both plants and animals, or you might have two different partner groups come together as a bigger group. So one set of partners looks at the animals for the national park, another set of partners looks at the plants for the national park. So really depending on time and materials, there's some options there of how that part can be facilitated. And then once students sort by land and water, again, they're looking for that evidence of biodiversity. How are these animals and plants similar and different? Are there a lot of different kinds? So as students get to the end of this lesson, they figure out that animals and plants can be found in different places on land and in water. There's different kinds of plants and different kinds of animals that live on land in the national parks, and there's different kinds of plants and different kinds of animals that live in or near water in the national parks as well. So now we're ready to share what we figured out with our classmates. So again, up to this point, we've been within the national park groups, and we're ready to come together as a class and start doing some comparisons across the national parks. So this returns us to the instructional model to highlight that lessons 9 and 10 are putting the pieces together moments. In these type of lessons, students connect what they figured out across multiple lessons and apply their ideas to the unit phenomenon. It's a time for students to take stock of their learning and work together to develop a stronger explanation of the unit question. So in lesson 9, our question is, how can we share information about the national parks with others? So remember, we've been doing research across the whole unit, and now we're ready to put that research together and have some shared sense making across what we figured out in our local area and the national parks. So in this lesson, students decide how they want to present their information that they've figured out so far about the kinds of plants and animals within the national park that they've been researching. So one of the suggestions is to do a video. One of the science and engineering practices that students work towards and develop in this unit is obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information. And part of that is how scientists use written and oral language, writings, drawings, and models in order to communicate information. And a video is a great way for students to really do all of that. So that's one of the suggested presentation formats for this final product for students to share. However, there are teacher tips of different ways that this might look. It could be a digital presentation. It might just be a spoken live presentation. There's a lot of different options and ways that students can communicate information. But regardless of the form of presentation that the class picks, the class works together to compile a gotta have it checklist of the important science ideas that they want to communicate, the artifacts from across the unit that they'll want to use as visuals, whether it's photographs of them, holding them up. Again, there's a lot of ways that this could look in classrooms. And something else that I'll mention is there are notes in each teacher guide that say which artifacts are important to keep for the end of the unit. So along the way in the materials prep or at the end of the lesson, there will be explicit places that say, make sure to hold on to this map or a photograph of this map, or make sure to collect this handout to use again at the end of the unit. So all of that will be available to students as artifacts to use for this final communicating of information with their classmates. So once students make that gotta have it checklist of the ideas to include and the artifacts to include, they work on putting together a script for their presentation where they can use writing they've already done or generate new writing to share with their classmates. And this lesson is kind of like a to be continued type lesson with lesson 10. So this is really like the planning and prepping lesson. And then navigating into lesson 10 is now we're ready to share those presentations. And so we're now ready to answer that second big question, like embedded into what lives where, what kinds of plants and animals live in different places. And in this lesson, students use their scripts and their artifacts to make their national park presentation videos or whichever format is chosen for the class to prepare to share those with others. Or this might look like just doing them live in small groups. Then students share their presentations. And there's support across lessons 9 and 10 in the form of a TREF to help facilitate this whole project from planning to writing, and presenting. So there's some great tips in that teacher reference for different ways to facilitate what happens in lesson 9 and also the presentations in lesson 10. So students do present in smaller groups with one student from each of the national parks. Again, they have a handout for this to help them notice patterns in the kinds of plants and animals across those different places. And then students are able to use that handout where they've been keeping track of patterns to the scientist circle at the end of the unit so the class can collectively answer what kinds of plants and animals live in different places. And so now that students have compared all the national parks, we can say that there is a pattern that different places have a variety of plants and animals. There is a pattern that plants and animals live on land and in water for all the national parks and our local community. So we also tie back to our community connections when we're thinking about those patterns. And different kinds of land and water can have similar and or different kinds of plants and animals. So within each of those broader patterns, students will have a lot of different data and examples to share, supporting those ideas in that final discussion. And this unit really sets a great foundation, building ideas about biodiversity and really the great variety of plants and animals that live in different places on land and in water. That students will then build on in later elementary grades when they start digging into more questions about why plants and animals live in those places. I also want to talk about a couple of the key features. So the first key feature that I want to talk about today is the ELA integration. So we talked a lot about this, especially in like lesson 2 and lesson 4 and lesson 8 when students are using the website. And also when students are communicating information in their putting pieces together lessons. So through the website, communicating information and also the various texts that students use to obtain information, there is so much ELA integration in this unit. And since this is the research unit and with all this ELA integration, something else to mention is there are teacher references along the way to help facilitate both like managing a research project within a science unit, and also how to facilitate this with students, different groupings, and also like different availabilities with technology and such. So there's so much I can mention, but a few key things that I to talk about is with the website itself, some features to highlight are everything on the website is read aloud to students. So even though students are doing really big things with research, it's presented in ways that are really second grade friendly for students, um, especially at different reading levels. Um, and also, as I mentioned, those different teacher references that talk about um, some ways to organize different groups, breaking up between the different national parks, and something that you'll notice in the teacher guides, as well as even though there are 6 national parks, the writers recommend that students only research 5 of them. And then the 6th is for the class to use as a whole class demonstration, which is built into the scaffolding within each lesson. So there's always that example national park there that teachers can use to demonstrate and model how to get onto the website, how to record information. It's also one that can be used with the mapping as well. So that's like an important support that I wanted to mention. That's part of the ELA integration. That might even feel familiar to other mentor type texts or strategies used in other parts of the school day. Another key feature of this unit is mapping and patterns. So as we talked about in the mapping lesson, students use patterns in different contexts like land and water and plant and animal diversity as they collect observations to use as data for map creation. And these are really important for students to communicate with. And in this unit, there's a lot of different ways that students can interact with maps, especially in lessons 4 and 5. And there's a lot of support for these activities, setting them up, using the materials, and also showing students that maps can look different, but use similar representations across different materials. So really building a nice foundation for students on how to use maps as models to represent land and water within this unit, and also tying it into using maps to communicate that information as well. And then I also wanted to highlight community connections. So again, throughout the unit, students investigate really big ideas about land, water, and biodiversity. And a lot of that time is spent in the national parks and researching the national parks. But in each lesson set, there is an out-of-school community connection that goes home. The first one in lesson 1, connections to places where plants and animals live. And then that one's for the first lesson set. And then the second one goes home in lesson 8, and that's the one about kinds of plants and animals. So these are ways for students to see that these patterns of shapes and kinds of land and water where as places where plants and animals live, and there being biodiversity in places like their schoolyard and the national parks like isn't isolated to individual places. Like this is something that they can see in their own communities. And through building these patterns of noticing um, patterns in land and water, patterns in biodiversity in their own communities, their schoolyard, the national parks. Again, it really sets up that work of, if students were to go to a new place, they could start thinking about what kinds of plants and animals might live here. So really building those connections both like locally and beyond. And then finally, I will briefly talk about the standards for Unit 2.3, Habitats and Biodiversity. So this unit builds towards 3 NGSS performance expectations, 1 life science performance expectation, and then 2 earth and space science performance expectations. There are 3 intentionally developed science and engineering practices, which we've mentioned across the storyline where these come up, planning and carrying out investigations. Developing and using models. This is really closely connected to the mapping and representing land and water on maps as models. and then also obtaining, evaluating, and communicating information. And then there are two intentionally developed cross-cutting concepts, patterns, and then also scale, proportion, and quantity. Okay.
All right. Thank you so much, Sam. You gave us a ton of information today. Teachers, just know that if you have other questions about the unit, you can reach out to us at OpenSciEd and we can help you navigate anything you need. There is one more thing I want to bring up, and that is that we do have additional resources on our website. You can reach us through our regular website. Our on-demand support library is wonderful. You can find previous webinar recordings from both point 1 and point 2 units. You can also see other resources, videos, narratives, things that will help you. Plus, you can now join our growing Facebook community. So if you're a second grade teacher that wants to talk to other second grade teachers in the country around your units, you can do that by joining our Facebook groups. And we thank you all for being here today. And thank you, Sam. That was a lot of fabulous information.